5 years ago, my partner and I joined the Great American Exodus from the big cities, hoping to put down roots in a town where we might qualify for a mortgage. We moved from the corner of Dean and Pacific in downtown Brooklyn to a half-acre lot on a quiet street in Madison, Wisconsin. Despite appearances, we quickly learned that Madison was not greeting newcomers with open arms. The city was in the middle of a public debate over urban growth some believed was out of control. A few years after we arrived, an issue arose in our neighborhood that made me realize how deep feelings ran. For as far back as anyone can remember, our neighborhood has been anchored by Mendota Mental Health Institute, a sprawling residential treatment center on hundreds of acres of prime lakefront property. In June of '95, the state announced its intention to sell off 2 large pieces of land at the edge of the institute, just a few blocks from our home. Now, my neighbors aren't naive about the value of property, but they were outraged by the possibility of losing access to this land. One of the parcels, 15 acres along Troy Drive, has been used for years by gardeners and residents as a wild, unofficial park.
Let's make the ladders.
I attended a public meeting to hear what was going to happen to the land. It turned out the meeting was not called by Mendota, but by a group of concerned residents who wanted to do something before it was too late.
They can maintain their dignity. It's one place where they know they've got a skill that's valued.
That first meeting led to a planning effort that is still going on 3 years later. In the end, our community succeeded in gaining control of the land. But more important than the victory was the work that led to it. For those of us who got involved with the Troy Drive Coalition, we unlearned our cynicism, replacing it with something more useful, an understanding of what it takes to make a community. Dane County, Wisconsin is in the middle of a metamorphosis. It's turning from a culture of close-knit farming communities to an economically and ethnically diverse metropolitan area. Madison's North Side is a good example. The city of Madison annexed the rural area around Mendota Institute during a post-war housing boom that brought a flood of new residents into the area. Over the years, the state assembly had passed a steady stream of legislation that forced Mendota Institute into a slow financial decline. By the late 80s, the campus around Mendota Institute in Wisconsin Central Colony was basically a high-security island surrounded by residential developments filled with families too young to remember the hospital's rich history. By 1995, the North Side as a whole had grown to include about 25,000 residents. While racially and economically diverse compared to the larger city, at the level of blocks, streets, and social patterns, it was undeniably segregated. The property that drew my neighbor's interest was a 15-acre rectangle of land on Troy Drive. The land was bordered on the south by a mix of rental and owner-occupied single-family homes that dated back to the 1920s. Directly to the east of the gardens were rows of apartment buildings on Karstens Avenue and Vera Court. Built in the 1970s and 80s, the subsidized rental complexes had experienced a bad period of crime, drugs, and landlord neglect, earning a reputation difficult to shake. To the north of the land lay several more apartment complexes, while to the south, quiet streets of working and middle-class families gradually gave way to the expensive lakefront homes of Woodward Drive. In the center of this half-mile square of segregated neighborhoods, the undeveloped, untended Troy land did what parks were meant to do. It brought us into contact with each other. It was a literal and symbolic crossroads of our community.
If we don't make a noise about things like this, then we're going to 1 acre ourselves completely into a paved city where seeing a blade of grass is going to be a miracle.
Luke Matthews gardened at the Troy Community Gardens until the day he and his wife saved up the money to move from a rented apartment to a 2-story house directly across the street.
It was a great place to meet people, instead of just running into the person who lived next door to you, to come out here and run into people who were doing the same kinds of things and to talk about raising tomatoes rather than complaining about the landlord.
In October of 1995, rumors spread of the impending sale of the land on which the gardens sat. Luke told his neighbors on Troy Drive and forged an early link between the two interest groups. With the help of the city's leading poverty prevention organization, the Community Action Coalition, the gardeners organized the Madison Community Gardeners Coalition.
At that point, I think was the turning point of bringing it to the press, bringing it to the public that community gardens are an issue.
We had very little time to work with, so we felt like what we needed to do first was to ask for an extension to see what might be done in the meantime. I remember going to the new state office building on East Wilson. We just laid it out and said, we've been here for 15 years or so. We have a lot invested in this, and if there's any way you can see delaying that sale till we can work out something more, we'd really like that. And as I said, much to my surprise, they agreed to do that.
Meanwhile, Luke's neighbors were worrying about the impact of the sale on their properties.
We talked to our neighbors on either side and realized that that something was happening and people were really concerned, and we all felt a little bit, I think, abashed by the fact that, or embarrassed by the fact that it seemed very personal in nature that we were concerned.
Does it bother you to perhaps be portrayed as a NIMBY?
Well, I suppose so, but there's a certain, I don't know, I suppose you have to be in that position to appreciate it somewhat. But like I said earlier, I mean, all of us who live in this neighborhood have had to scrimp and save and sacrifice and wait to get to the position where we can have a house in a neighborhood that we like, and then to be in the position of having all of that threatened. If that's what underlies being a NIMBY, then I don't like the phrase NIMBY, but fine. It's not a nuclear plant going in across the street. We're not burying toxic wastes or anything like that, but it changes the character of the neighborhood.
The gardeners and residents didn't join forces on the issue until the following spring. They were brought together when both looked to the Northside Planning Council for assistance. The NPC was an umbrella group for neighborhood associations on the North Side. The NPC had a small budget and an ambitious goal of revitalizing North Side neighborhoods. Tim Carlisle was the NPC's only paid staff.
And the goal at that point is really just to get the word out that this is something that's happening in your community, and it's almost like asking or giving people the opportunity to say, do you care about it? If an organization is really going to be community-based and kind of community-led, then the initiative for getting involved has to come back from the community. Normally when land gets sold like this, it's a decision that kind of gets made for the community as to what goes on. So we're saying today that this is a decision that we should be making together as a community with our elected officials and with the city staff that are charged with implementing the city's land plan, not something that should be made for us. As a facilitator that has an interest not just in this project, and since the Planning Council in part uses each individual project to kind of build the overall community capacity to take on these issues, you want to encourage people to be as directly involved as possible.
Any change in what it is undesirable.
These are more conceptual, but any use which creates wealth for people outside of the area but doesn't profit the people in the community in any way
to me, that's what turned me on to this whole process. That's what sustained me for over a year involved in this process. I mean, there was a spirit there that got people together, that there was something that said people could do something, people can change, really affect change in their community, in their neighborhood, in their lives.
Sounds like there are some valuable uses that the community has now on the property that we want to maintain in some way.
The original action by the gardeners and that the planning council joined in supporting, although we didn't initiate it, was simply to ask the state to delay the sale so they could make plans to move the gardens. Well, now there's enough interest in the community that the goal starts to shift to, well, can we keep them where they're at?
I guess I felt there was a big switch fast, that it had gone from being at our dining room table and talking to neighbors to going into a meeting, and it's in the church. It was in Mary's church, and they're in the basement, and there's cookies and lemonade, and people are bringing their little daughters with their Barbie dolls, and we were still sort of just getting together and getting to know each other and say, oh, isn't that terrible? So that meeting was a big leap.
My faith in the process was increased enormously by just watching Tim do the facilitation. Immediately, I felt very comfortable with the way he was conducting these meetings. I was a little worried about it at first, just by appearances. Who is this kind of scraggly guy?
The other undesirable uses are industrial or large-scale retail, commercial.
The first public meeting drew a large crowd. It took Tim 3 hours to listen to and summarize the group's concerns.
High density.
What would you like to see have happen with the rest of the land?
They will like it to be gardens and stuff, and if they don't have the garden, they have nothing to eat then. So it's very important for the time. When they get really mad, they just come and look at the garden, and then somehow, some way, it makes my mom and them happy again.
The broad spectrum of concerns on the table proved to be the project's greatest strength and its greatest weakness. Had only one group's interest been at stake, others might not have been willing to support the cause. On the other hand, a diversity of interests meant at times the group had to struggle to find common ground.
More intensive use of what's actually there are some limits to that, but we haven't reached either.
Making sure all those interests stayed in the process and people stayed connected to it and didn't just turn it over to somebody else to do meant that the community needed to have a structure for some ongoing information gathering, decision making, and that structure would needed to be representative to keep all those interests engaged. And so the idea of a steering committee as a way to continue to move forward emerged.
To start with, we should just talk about sort of ideal visions, and I guess also recognize that I want to qualify by saying that we may come out of here with a list tonight, but I don't know if this meeting is really an equal and full representation of all the different groups that could and will be involved. So this could get revised in the future, but I think it's worthwhile to make a start.
As of last year, there were 101 families that were gardening there, and they had 453 people in those families.
Because the meetings took place at night, young families and second shift workers had a hard time participating. The gardening interest, made up largely of low-income Southeast Asian and African American families, faced the greatest challenge. A handful of individuals, led by Hope Finkelstein and Joe Mathers, did their best to represent the group's concerns.
I think there are people who care about community. We're doing it in that context, but we care about the land too, and our hobby, our passion, our interest in gardening is connected to a land ethic, to a sense of community, to a whole lot of issues, and this is where they come together at this site.
I felt very strongly that it's to not speak for anybody, but make sure, like when people would say, well, why aren't the gardeners here? I mean, first of all, there's a real language issue, and no matter how many translators you have at the table, it's not going to be translated because people aren't, culturally, they're not used to these kind of community kind of debates. So even the times when people were there, you know, people don't have much tolerance or patience for slowing the process down and translation, and it turns into a whole different kind of experience.
What you're walking into tonight is a meeting of something that's been going on for a long time. There's a piece of property.
It's something I've struggled with a lot because I went to various organizing meetings and tried to find ways to reach more gardeners. There's clearly a strong social function to the gardening, and it's very much a family activity. And that was something I enjoyed seeing. Whether they took from the experience anything more than what they grew, I mean, that's for them to say. I might have liked it better, but under the circumstances, I'm not sure that it's realistic to have expected more than that.
And then once I
Throughout the process, the steering committee members used a variety of facilitation strategies to stimulate community participation. If your mom knows about the meetings that have been going on to try and get the gardeners helping, talking to the city about this?
I think we sent flyers around, but since I have a job and I have to go to the after-school program, I don't have time to go there translate for her. So that's why we don't participate in it.
Thanks.
Doing more outreach to everybody, but particularly to groups who normally don't, and in this case didn't actively participate in the process, would have been a wonderful thing that we could have done had we had more time and resources. But it's always a small group of people in anything. It's not just in community stuff.
I feel like my role as a representative, at the very least, could help just the process proceed in an ethical manner.
Get folks together again and say, okay, this is where we've gotten to now, and let's talk about it.
Strongest probably consensus that emerged was that the gardens were very important, not just because of the food that low-income residents that were using the gardens produced on them, but also because they were a form of open space that the more middle-class neighborhood homeowners nearby valued, and so it was an instant rallying point.
While we talked, the state of Wisconsin closed the sale on the other Mendota parcel located a quarter-mile away at the intersection of Sawdoff Road and Green Avenue. The parallel development of Sawdoff added a dramatic backdrop to our discussions.
The word development can be a very broad and, to most people, scary word. Development could be anything from mass housing to transit to government buildings to a prison, for an example, or maybe something as positive as a theme park. Each developer, or quote developer, the terminology of somebody wanting to divide land up for housing, has a different approach and a different outcome, and they're really looking at highest and best use. What can they use a piece of land for to develop that's going to best be either A, profitable, or B, both, hopefully benefit that area. With the Meadow Ridge neighborhood, what we're trying to achieve, and the goal is really to complement what's already existing here. And with the Westport Meadows, the joining neighborhood that we're going to continue on, and we wanted to look at the housing that was built in there and which ones, architecturally wise and different things, can we improve on, and to really take the best few homes in there and start with there as a basis. In this particular site, you're looking at approximately 18 acres, and you're going to find that you're going to end up with probably around 65 to 70 homes in here. And that's really based on planning with the city and developers together. And you're going to find most lots are going to average about 10,000 square feet. And that's for two reasons: to keep the values with less land used, and also you need that to facilitate an average single-family home for fire space, so you're not too close to have too much density.
Density. Sometime in the last 10 years, density became a swear word in suburban America. From the beginnings of the Troy planning process, residents argued against high-density, multifamily rental housing.
Just putting in a whole bunch of apartments or multi-family dwellings that are all close together, and they wouldn't be doing a favor for the people that end up living there. That doesn't sound like such a great place to live. Why not use some discretion with the planning instead of trying to make a whole lot of money off it? Try to do something that's socially responsible with that land instead.
Community gardening satisfied Amy Lang's criteria for socially responsible. Unfortunately, while bigger cities like Philadelphia invest big bucks in community gardens to stimulate urban renewal, small cities like Madison are reluctant to set aside valuable land that could contribute to the tax base. Lacking public protection, squatter gardens all over the city were being shut down at an alarming rate. Under pressure of an impending deadline, the frustrated steering committee began to think creatively about other funding options.
Our position has always been, and always will be, that you have to do a certain amount of development in order to generate some funds to support some open space development. To those folks who want the whole thing to remain open, my answer is good luck, and if you can find the money and convince the city and the state and the community that's what ought to happen, go ahead.
Had the idea of housing come from a private developer, it would have been rejected. But Saul's group, the Madison Area Community Land Trust, was a nonprofit, community-based organization that wanted to secure community control over land.
I'd propose low-density owner-occupied residential use. The question was, since they didn't have the resources, was there anything we could do? And we took the position that although we're primarily interested in housing, we aren't really a housing land trust, we're a community land trust.
Heather Mann, director of a second land trust called the Urban Open Space Foundation, supported Saul's plan, agreeing to be the conservation agent for the open space. UOSF would use its connections to secure financing with which to buy the development rights on the acreage.
We're talking about restricting the land's use on that 10.2 acres forever for gardens and for the protection of natural areas.
The only problem was MACLT's commitment to affordable housing. To some members of the community, affordable housing was just a more polite way of saying density housing.
From discussions with neighbors that I've had, for a lot of people, affordable housing, as they may understand it or perceive it, would not be the larger community's preference to the extent they represent the larger community. So there are some people, at least on the north side, that would say we don't need any more affordable housing as they think of it. Is this group prepared to say that they've reached consensus that they're recommending that affordable and/or mixed income owner-occupied housing be the type of housing that's developed on the third of the property?
My feeling is it's